All right, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott from Jeff Teaches Programming. It's been a while since I've recorded, but I thought I'd make at least one more today. And what I've been doing in the last several videos is I've been going through and taking this BMI program that we've been working on and creating it. I had it working as a database program, but it used what's called ADO.net or ActiveX Data Objects.net, where we had to write a lot of the code ourselves. And I'm converting it into a C DataGridView program where more of the stuff will be created for us. Now, one thing I wanted to say was I started taking a look at this, and I thought, with some of the stuff that's in here, maybe I could do a little better job of explaining the stuff that's in here. So I'm going to take at least one video, and I'm going to go over some of these database files that are in here, starting with App.config. Now, just taking it from the top, first thing that you see in here is an XML tag. What this says is that what follows is being created in the extensible markup language. Now, this is not an XML class. Believe it or not, I've taught XML. All right, but let me just tell you that somewhere approximately 30 years ago or so, someone came up with a bright idea that HTML, or the hypertext markup language, was kind of dead. It shouldn't be used anymore. Well, that's not true, and it is still used. But what they decided to do is to come up with a new language that was called XML, or the extensible markup language. The main difference between XML and HTML is with HTML, the hypertext markup language, you have 100 or so tags that have a certain meaning, and they're used in virtually everything you do. In XML, or the extensible markup language, you make your own tags. All right, so for instance, you might have a carpenter's XML, where table there might mean a table, something made out of wood with 4 legs, as opposed to an HTML table. There was math XML, there was chemical XML, heck, I've even seen chess XML. There's a whole lot of them. But what this says is that we're going to be using the extensible markup language, version 1, and the encoding UTF, which I believe is like Universal Transformation Format. Basically, it says that it's going to allow for international characters to be used. Now, I went and looked online, and I found this, and I'm even going to put up here, this is the URL for it. Let me move this up a bit. All right, try this. All right, it's xml.com, a general introduction to XML. And there is the URL for it. I'll leave it up there for a second. All right. Now it says, author's note, it is somewhat remarkable to think that this article, initially appearing in the winter 1997 edition of the World Wide Web Journal, was out of date by the time the XML recommendation was approved in February. So why am I even showing you that? Well, it does explain the main things that you have in XML. All right. Again, it's not my goal or my intention in here to make this an XML class, but if you're interested, you could have a look. There's other articles. You can also go to the w3schools.com. I think it's /tutorials/XML, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe I am. Yes, I am. Maybe it's just tutorial. I don't know. And it doesn't look at phone that either, but let's look real quick. So if I go into here and I go in and look under tutorials, there's somewhere in here, I know there's going to be one for XML. There it is, Learn XML. Down at the bottom. So it was W3 Schools XML. So if you want to learn more, this is a place you can go to. All right. I've already spent way too much time talking about that. So let's go on. So close that. All right. So the XML thing declares that the file is written in XML with the version shown. The encoding, again, says it's going to support international characters. All right. Then next, we've got configuration. Notice with XML, you need opening tags and you need closing tags. So there's our beginning configuration tag. There's our ending configuration tag. There's our beginning connection strings tag, and there's our ending connection strings tag. For configuration, it's telling us that this is the root element, okay? Everything inside of it defines the configuration settings we're going to have for this particular application. And .NET looks for this different stuff inside of this element. All right, so again, there's the beginning of it. And there's the end of it. Then next we've got connection strings. That defines the part of the file that's specifically dedicated to database connection strings. All right? It keeps the database information centralized. It makes it easy to change because it's all in one place. And it's separate from the actual application code. All right? So what's in here? Well, you'll notice this does not have an ending tag. That ends it right there. But if we look at what's in here, let's just take a quick look. The first thing that we've got is, we're adding a connection string, right? Okay, and we're telling it name equals person.db. This is basically going to be used to reference the connection string in our code. All right. Then we've got the actual connection string itself, which is here. Technically, it's all of that, but I'm just going to, for now, we'll look at it here. All right. So let's look at it and break it down bit by bit. The first thing that we've got in here is the data source. That's right here. All right. And what it's doing is it's letting us know that we're using Microsoft SQL Server and we're using it on our own machine. That's the local DB part that's in there. Okay, so local DB basically is what's referred to typically as a lightweight server that's used for development. In other words, if this was a production application, we have the name of an actual server on there, not our own machine. All right. When you use this, the default name for local DB is going to be MS SQL local DB. All right. So this is saying connect to a local SQL server database using this machine, or it's on this machine. Then we've got initial catalog equals person.db. Initial catalog is the name of the database that we're going to use. All right, so this says once we connect, the database that we're going to be using in here is person.db. All right, so after you made your connection to the server, this is the database we'll use. Then we have integrated security equals true. That lets SQL Server know we're using Windows authentication. So in other words, the person who has been logged in here is the one that's going to be the owner of this. There's no username, there's no password that's stored in this file. All right. Finally, we have this trust certificate equals true. All right. That tells the client that we should trust the server's SSL certificate. So in other words, it's going to skip any validation that would have to be done otherwise. All right? So why do we even have this? Okay? Basically, local DB uses some kind of a self-signed certificate. And if you don't have this setting in here, your connection may fail. I'm not saying it will, but it can fail. So it's recommended that you put that in. Finally, we've got in here, provider name equals Microsoft.data.sql client. All right. This lets the system know that the provider used to connect to SQL Server is the modern one. It's the recommended one, Microsoft.data.sql client. That's the recommended SQL Server driver. This tells .NET how it's going to communicate with the database. All right. Then we've got the ending tag for our connection strings. Then we've got the ending tag for our configuration. So that's everything that's in there. All right. The other one, or next one I wanted to go over, and these are pretty small files, as you can see. They pretty much fit onto one screen. But the next one that I wanted to talk about for a couple minutes is this BMIDbContext file. All right. You'll notice at the top we've got the using statement, and technically, since it's grayed out, that means we really don't need it. But the using system allows us to use all the system functionality. Amongst other things, what's provided in that file is the definitions of how you can use the different data types: int, string, bool, etc. All right. Next, we've got the using Microsoft.Entity Framework Core. That basically imports the EF or Entity Framework Core types. All right. And the one we're going to use in here, well, one of the ones we're going to use in here is dbset a little bit later. All right. And the DB context right there. All right. Next, we've got using system.configuration right here. This gives us the ability to use the configuration manager. All right. And it's going to let, basically, it's used to read values from at the App.config file that we just looked at. All right. Then going on, this basically says, with our namespace, this says that the file is going to be housed in a folder called data that's in a folder called BMILibrary. And you already have seen this in the past. That is exactly BMILibrary data and then BMIDbContext.cs. All right. This says the name of the class is going to be BMIDbContext, and it inherits from dbContext. Basically, everything that you use is going to, when you use a dbContext file, is going to inherit from dbContext. That's EF Core's base class, basically. It provides a lot of different things, some of which we'll probably never talk about in here, things like change tracking, but later we may or may not get into things like query translation. So when we write a query in a language known as LINQ, it'll convert it for us into SQL. All right, and it allows us to use our database connections and our CRUD functionality. All right, so again, notice we're almost to the end already. Then we've got this. This declares a DB set, a database set. This means this represents a table. All right, DB set person entity is going to be a table of person entity records. People is going to be the name used in code when we want to query our table. All right, so this allows the mapping that must take place between what we create in here, and we're going to look at that in just a minute, all right, what we create in there, and how it's connected, so to speak, to the actual database itself. All right, next we've got this. So this is what's left. We're up to line 12. And there's about 20 lines in here. I'm not going to go over the curly braces. But next we've got this protected override. This overrides, in other words, it says when we override this, we want to use this DB context on configuring method, but we want to use it in our own way, so to speak. That's used to configure how the context is going to connect to the actual database. This tells EF Core, basically the stuff that's in here is going to tell the system what it is we want to use. Now, I'm looking in here. We've got BMI database 2, and back what we just looked at in here, where was that? In our App.config file, all right, we've got Person.cs. Okay, this is the database, Person.cs, all right, and in here, this says BMI database 02. Now I'm concerned because to me, there's a difference between those. All right. So should this be Person.cs or should this be BMI database 2? Well, my thought is this actually should be in here. BMI database 02. Now I could be wrong, and if it is, I'll change it back again, which would mean this will have to be the same. But there has to be a mapping that's taking place between these files, and I think if I give them different names, there won't be that mapping. All right? So we're telling it to read the connection string. The configuration manager that you see in here, this configuration manager, what it's going to do, this right here, all right, is going to read the connection string. So the configuration manager reads settings from the app.config file. The .connection strings right here, this looks up the connection string by name. It says this must match exactly what's in the config file, and now it does. It didn't before. All right, this keeps the database credentials out of the code. Okay? So, look at this kind of to summarize here. This defines an entity framework core or an EF core DB or database context. It connects the application to an SQL Server database. All right? It basically does what's typically referred to as it exposes this people table via the DB set of person entity records. It reads the database connection string, and it's going to enable us to be able to do our different link operations, our CRUD operations. Let me do a file save all here. All right, I don't think I need app.config anymore. I don't think I need the DB context anymore. The last one I'd like to mention in here quickly is this one. All right. We already talked about the using system, and again, it's grayed out, so we probably don't need it. But technically, we're using it in here because we've got int, we've got string, etc. So I'm not sure exactly why that's grayed out. All right, because using system imports the system namespace, which provides access to any and all fundamental .NET data types, things like date time that we use in here, all right, etc. Int, all right. Next, we've got this, using system.componentModel.data annotations. This imports data annotation attributes. It allows us to put in things like key, required, max length, etc. All right, so then, again, we've got this namespace, which is telling us that this file lives in the BMI library folder and the data folder underneath it. So when we take a look here, let's see if we can get it all on the screen here. Pretty much. I suppose I can if I make this smaller. Don't want to make it too small. We'll keep it like that for now. How's that? All right. So taking it from the top then, in fact, let's make this bigger because I want to make sure you're able to see everything that's in here, okay? All right, so taking it from the top then, we're letting the system know that the primary key for this particular, what is going to map into an SQL table is called Person ID. It's an integer and it's going to automatically increment. So it's marking this, it's a property with a Y because it's got a get set. And remember, get allows you to read values, set allows you to set values. So we're saying this is the primary key. It's an integer and it's called Person ID. Next, we have a first name and a last name. Both of those fields are required. Both of those fields have a maximum length of 50 characters. All right, hopefully that, just looking at that, that makes sense. So it limits the size to 50 characters, which typically will improve database performance, as opposed to not giving it a size thing at all. We're telling it, since it says it's required, it cannot be null. All right, and you'll notice that both of them default to string.empty. So what it initializes is to an empty string. This is going to make sure we have no null reference type of issues. Then next, we've got the height and the weight. All right, it stores the person's height in inches. It stores the person's weight in pounds. They're both in there as integers or as whole numbers. All right, ints will automatically default to 0. Okay, and with ints, basically they're implicitly required. All right. Next, we've got the same kind of thing, but rather than it being an int, it's a double. And really, I guess I left this off. We could have made these required as well. Probably should have, to be honest with you. So we could come in here and say required. And we can do the same thing for this, for this one right here. Now, not only can you require these, but if you want to, you can set them up so that if something's missing, we could have added in here error equals. So if there's an error, we could have our own error message. I'm just going to let the system error message take over. All right. And then finally, the last thing that we have in here is date time. And that's our date created. All right. That's going to store when the record was created. It's automatically going to be set in our code to the current date when you insert a record. So to quickly go over this one, what this does is it represents a record or a row in our table. It uses Entity Framework Core. This file defines the columns we're going to use, or fields, whatever you want to call them, the different data types that those correspond to, any validation rules that we have in there, and it sets up our primary key. This will again allow us to do our CRUD operations later. All right. Now I'm at 25 minutes, so I'm going to stop right now, and we'll pick it up again in the next lecture. See you then.